On May 14, 1973, a Saturn V rocket blasted off from Kennedy Space Center to thunderous applause. Attached to the rocket was precious cargo. The $2.5 billion Skylab, America's first space station. But seconds after takeoff, disaster struck. A gap of less than half a centimeter between Skylab's thermal heat shield and the body of the space station allowed a pocket of air to form underneath. The resulting pressure snapped the 3 aluminum tension straps that held the shield of the spacecraft, causing it to rip away. Soon after Skylab reached its intended orbit, Mission Control realized the space station was critically damaged.
The temperatures inside the workshop began to go up, and it didn't take them too long to figure out that they had lost the heat shield during launch. And this heat shield ripped around to solar panel number 1. It took it off the vehicle too, but when it got to the second solar panel, it ripped around it, fortunately, and left it intact. But a piece of aluminum strap from the heat shield riveted itself into the solar panel cover and kept it from deploying more than about a foot.
If Skylab's second main solar panel were set free, the space station could generate enough electricity to perform its mission. But without a thermal heat shield, the temperatures inside Skylab would make it unlivable. If Skylab were lost, the future of the American space program would be in jeopardy. The crew of Skylab 2, who were to occupy the space station the following day, had their mission postponed indefinitely.
There were questions that had to have answers in order for us to go. One was, how can we get some kind of a sunshade over the sunny side of Skylab to cool the temperatures so that it's livable in the first place? The second one is, how do we get that solar panel freed up?
Devising a plan for how the astronauts could attach the replacement heat shield to the space station would be the biggest hurdle. Several NASA departments worked on designs that involved the astronauts replacing Skylab's heat shield while performing a spacewalk. But the tethered constraints necessary for a spacewalk would make it difficult to deploy and anchor a replacement thermal shield. NASA engineer Jack Kinzler used some inside information to develop a different strategy.
There was a trainer equivalent to it right in the buildings where I work. So I thought, why don't I walk over to the building and look around? There was a camera that was designed on the outboard end of the Skylab, and I saw that camera port. And gosh, I knew it was near the damaged area. So my thoughts just clicked over, and I bet I can put something through that 8-inch port that can expand and get big enough to lay out a very repairable piece of material.
Kinzler ran with his idea. Within hours, engineers stitched together a 24-square-foot piece of mylar and placed it inside a 4-foot-long, 8-inch-wide aluminum box that would fit Skylab's scientific airlock. Kinzler then demonstrated his theory to NASA chiefs.
Now, there's at least a dozen people there, all the top people from NASA that could get close to it. And they were there watching all this. So the instant that thing splayed out on the floor, I had them all walk over to me and say, "You've got it. That's it."
With NASA's approval, Kinzler's group started building Skylab's replacement sunshade. After the fabric for the parasol was complete, Kinzler worked on designing a deployment mechanism that would allow his parasol to open up in a uniform fashion, much like an umbrella.
I had devised a 4-way spring. It had 4 coil springs all set in a little container. They were timed, and as soon as they emerged, they would all spring simultaneously, and they open up all 4 sides.
Just 9 days after Skylab reached its planned orbit, Kinzler's sunshade was rushed to Cape Canaveral and placed inside a Saturn IV B rocket, designated Skylab 2. Its crew, Joe Kerwin, Paul Weitz, and Pete Conrad, would attempt to save the crippled space station.
Callie, the Skylab. We got her in daylight. Solar Wing 1 is in fact partially deployed and the reason that you...
On May 25th, the astronauts of Skylab 2 docked with the space station and felt the impact of Skylab's lost heat shield firsthand.
The docking adapter and the airlock were not extremely hot because they hadn't lost their heat shield. The workshop where we are now had lost its heat shield, and it was about 130 degrees. It was very hot. It was like being in the engine room of an old Navy ship. Pete Conrad and Paul came back down with the container containing Jack Kinsler's parasol. What Pete and Paul did was to take the container, stick it into the Sunnyside airlock, and deploy the parasol through it.
Per Kinsler's design, Weitz and Conrad connected a series of 6 32-inch long interlocking rods. They then pushed the assemblage through an opening in the back of the metal canister, attaching it to the parasol. The astronauts then opened the airlock and used the push rod to move the parasol out into space. Conrad then pressed a release knob that activated Kinsler's spring mechanism, forcing the sunshade open. The temperature inside Skylab eventually stabilized at 80 degrees. Days later, the astronauts performed a spacewalk and freed the jammed solar panel. With only one main solar panel and a makeshift heat shield, Skylab looked worse for wear, but the space station worked.
Well, Apollo 13 was the mission where the crew was saved by flight control. Skylab was the mission that was saved by the engineering community. It was a great 10 days watching everybody do their job.
Astronauts Joe Kerwin, Pete Conrad, and Paul Weitz lived on Skylab for a record 28 days. Over the next 12 months, 2 additional manned missions to the space station followed. In 1974, the hugely successful Skylab program came to an end.
On July 11th, 1979, Skylab returned to Earth in an uncontrolled trajectory. It crashed in a remote area of Western Australia, killing 1 cow.
Now, on the 20th century,
flying over the territorial airspace of a sovereign country is an act of war.
caught in the act.
I realize that I've committed a grave crime.
High-stakes spying and secret missions sometimes wound up in embarrassing mistakes.
When you make these kinds of mistakes, not only do you kill people, but you cause your own government a giant political black eye, and you undermine support for the very kind of operation you're trying to undertake.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. During the height of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union took big chances spying on one another, trying to gain as much top-secret information as they could. There was always the risk that such a mission could go bad, bringing with it the threat of military retaliation. But President Eisenhower was desperate to find out more about the secrecy-shrouded Soviet Union during the 1950s, so he authorized overflights of Russian territory by a high-altitude spy plane called the U-2.
All of a sudden, you had an enormous world open up before them because you had enormously powerful cameras on a plane that was invulnerable, basically.
The plane was one of the technological marvels of the 1950s. Designed and built in less than 2 years, the U-2 was part glider, part jet. It flew at then unheard-of altitudes of more than 70,000 feet, allowing American pilots to spy safely over the heart of the Soviet Union for the first time.
68,000 feet was considered to be the highest level that a Soviet MiG fighter could go. In other words, if you could fly higher than 68,000 feet, there was nothing on Earth that could intercept and shoot you down.
But while the Soviets could not knock down the U-2, they were able to track American flights with radar.
They knew exactly where these planes came in and where they exited and how long they were over the country and what targets they were flying over. When the U-2 was originally built, it was thought that they would maybe fly above radar coverage, but they never did.
To President Eisenhower, though, the photographs and other data that the U-2 brought back seemed worth the diplomatic risk.
Eisenhower, in fact, did say on numerous occasions that what we were doing was tantamount to a declaration of war. And he said that if the Soviet Union ever overflew the United States with this type of operation, the United States not only should shoot these planes down, but the United States could see this as tantamount to a declaration of war, which is a rather remarkable statement coming from someone who's been agreeing to overfly the Soviet Union since 1956.
But as the diplomatic climate between the two superpowers improved, President Eisenhower sharply curtailed U-2 flights, allowing only one in 1959. And that was the year Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made his first trip to the United States.
And there they are, President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev coming down the red carpet, laid for the Premier. He's greeting United States Secretary of State Christian Herter. A warm handshake, a joke between the two men.
Khrushchev's 13 days in America included stops ranging from Hollywood to an Iowa farm. As he departed, Khrushchev's words were warm.
Хорошим американским словом. Окей? Хорошо. До свидания, друзья.
From the bottom of my heart, I want to express my gratitude for your kind hospitality, for your bread and salt, as they say in our country. I hope that in the relationships between our two countries, we will be able to use more and more often the good, short American word, okay, until we meet again, friends.
Khrushchev presented himself as a human leader. Americans responded rather well to Khrushchev, and there seemed to be some momentum.
Momentum toward a relaxation of tension, which laid the groundwork for a four-power summit conference to take place in Paris the following year. It would include the U.S., the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. After the Paris summit, President Eisenhower would then visit the Soviet Union.
The Soviets were talking about peaceful coexistence. Eisenhower was no fool. He did not expect the Soviets to lay down their arms and allow capitalism to develop throughout the world. But by the same token, he recognized that he and Khrushchev had certain things in common. They shared a mutual interest in preventing nuclear war.
But as the May 1960 summit approached, Eisenhower's advisors convinced him to risk flying U-2 missions again. That was because the Soviets had successfully tested an intercontinental ballistic missile in August of 1957. And intelligence reports were saying that one or more of those missiles carrying nuclear weapons might be operational in northern Russia near the Arctic Circle.
And for the United States, that was the most dangerous place because that was the shortest route between Russia and the United States. It was only maybe half an hour flight for a missile to take off from the Kola Peninsula area to fly up to hit the United States.
So Eisenhower authorized 3 U-2 reconnaissance flights for early 1960 to find out whether the reports were true. The third flight, flown by a pilot named Francis Gary Powers, would be the most ambitious.
This flight would go from the south, from Pakistan, cross over the Soviet Union, and exit near Murmansk in the northern part of the country. This would be the first direct and complete overflight of the Soviet Union.
Originally, the president wanted the mission completed by April 16th, a full month before the summit. But bad weather and mechanical difficulties delayed it more than 2 weeks to May 1st, the final day a plane would be allowed to fly.
Eisenhower had stipulated that under no circumstances should an American U-2 violate Soviet airspace after May 1st. So the planners at CIA had their backs to the deadline, and they went ahead.
The one thing that bothers Eisenhower is that if something does happen, it is now going to occur virtually at the moment he is ready to leave for Paris to meet Khrushchev for a vital summit that will really determine Eisenhower's own place in history. And that, I think, is what makes him very, very nervous.
Unknown to Eisenhower at the time, the Soviets had developed an anti-aircraft missile capable of downing the high-flying U-2. The May 1st flight gave the Russians the chance they'd been waiting for.
Francis Gary Powers sees an orange explosion behind the cockpit. The explosion creates enormous turbulence, and his plane begins to disintegrate. He pushes open the canopy and is about to hit the ejector button when he is sucked out of the cockpit. His parachute opens automatically, but he's unable to reach the destruct button so that it falls in pieces to the ground.
When he realized the plane was missing, Eisenhower authorized the U.S. government to issue a cover story 2 days after the plane was down.
Now, it was assumed that the U-2 would be destroyed and that the U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, would die, and therefore there would not be any evidence to contradict the American cover story.
Eisenhower lived in this kind of dream world where he believed that with some embarrassment and a little bit of lying, he could get away with the story that this was a weather plane that had taken off from Turkey and thought it was still over Turkey and had accidentally violated Soviet airspace and had gone down.
2 days after the U.S. issued that story, the Soviets announced they had shot down an American plane, but they withheld the fact that they had also captured Powers. In response, the U.S. embellished the story of the weather plane a bit more.
The United States would throw out a lie. The Russians would contradict it with a little bit of truth. The United States would throw out another lie. A little bit more truth would be put on the table by the Russians. And each time, the United States embarrassed itself more.
Until finally, 6 days after the plane was shot down, Nikita Khrushchev publicly announced the secret he had withheld for nearly a week, that Francis Gary Powers was, in his words, alive and kicking.
So you had the pilot not only alive, but he was talking. The Russians were interrogating him, and he was telling them exactly what was going on, that he was on a spying mission and that they were collecting intelligence flying over Russia.
Of course, the revelation shattered the American cover story about a weather plane.
President Eisenhower wanted to save the summit. He felt immediately the summit was imperiled. And on the 11th of May, he took full responsibility.
No one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attack. Secrecy in the Soviet Union makes this essential. It is a distasteful but vital necessity.
Eisenhower then proceeded to Paris, hoping the summit could be saved. An enraged Khrushchev threatened to walk out unless the U.S. issued an apology, ceased all U.S. overflights, and promised to punish all those responsible for the U-2 fiasco.
Eisenhower honestly believed that Khrushchev had determined that Paris must fail, that the United States must pay a price for what it had done. The United States must be humiliated, and he had set conditions that Dwight Eisenhower could not possibly accept.
The efforts at conciliation failed. The conference at the summit is over. The huge reservoir of hope that this meeting would ease the Cold War is as empty tonight as this room at the Élysée Palace.
A year later, and out of office, Eisenhower reflected on Khrushchev's walkout.
When you think of all the fuss he made about U-2, there was a lot of theatrics about that. He'd known of this for several years. Their radar had tracked a number of our planes. They knew all about it. But finally, one fell, and he made a great theatrical production of it, and that was that.
The consequences of the failed summit, according to many historians, were severe.
I think that this summit had at least the possibility of a serious arms agreement in which the United States was willing to have a negotiation in which both sides would dramatically limit the production of nuclear weapons.
Instead, the U-2 fiasco ushered in the tensest period of the Cold War.
That we shall pay any price.
John F. Kennedy, for a number of reasons, one of which showing that he can stand up to a belligerent Soviet adversary, initiates the Bay of Pigs invasion shortly after taking office. And rather remarkably, the year after that, in 1962, a U-2 plane overflying Cuba finds evidence that the Soviet Union has put medium-range missiles into Cuba, and this essentially now triggers probably the most frightening single moment of the Cold War, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis.
As for Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot shot down over the Soviet Union, he was exchanged in 1962 for Rudolf Abel, convicted in the United States of spying for the Russians. Powers' flight was the last U-2 mission over Russian territory. And so for intelligence information, the U.S. turned to satellites and to ships bristling with electronic equipment. But it wasn't long before those ships got into trouble, too. That story when the 20th century resumes. In the 1960s, the U.S. developed a fleet of small ships designed to spy on other countries. Those vessels would sit just outside a country's territorial waters, eavesdropping on communications and analyzing radar transmissions. But it wasn't long before they ran into trouble, too. The first time during the Six-Day War in the Middle East in 1967.
There's no doubt it was an intelligence ship. It was monitoring communications. It was spying. The Israelis didn't like that and didn't want it to go on spying.
The intelligence ship in question, the Liberty, was attacked by Israeli planes and torpedo boats on the fourth day of the war. 34 Americans were killed, another 171 were wounded. William McGonigal, captain of the Liberty, made a frantic attempt to get away.
They managed to sail this ship with all these dead sailors on it and an enormous torpedo hole in its side and listing, and sail it all the way back from the Sinai Peninsula to Malta.
As she limps here into the harbor of Malta, headed for dry dock, the Liberty is still a floating coffin. Aside from the 9 bodies already flown to America, 22 more bodies are trapped below decks in compartments flooded when struck by an Israeli torpedo. The Liberty is still shrouded in secrecy. Newsmen are not allowed on board. Sailors on board are not allowed to talk to newsmen.
Israel claimed it had mistaken the Liberty for an Egyptian ship, a story former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban stuck to more than 30 years later.
It was totally an accident as far as we were concerned, because nobody expected either that the boat called Liberty would be involved in our region, and it was certainly not involved with our knowledge or with our consent.
Israel later paid reparations to the U.S. government, to the wounded, and to the families of the dead, but the full story remained to be told.
It was on such a secret level in that the full facts could never be stated by either side. Maybe someday we will get more of the real evidence about exactly what went on. Maybe we won't.
A little more than 6 months later, another American spy ship, the Pueblo, got into trouble, spying on North Korea.
The Pueblo, in 1968, was on its maiden reconnaissance mission in the Sea of Japan off the coast of Korea. It was in international waters collecting intelligence, signals intelligence, from Korea.
The Pueblo was the smallest ocean-going ship in the U.S. Navy at the time. It was a converted AKL, which stands for light cargo ship. The ship style itself is most noted for having been the exact type ship that was used in the film production Mr. Roberts.
On the morning of January 23rd, 1968, 4 North Korean gunboats and 2 subchasers suddenly attacked the Pueblo.
I don't think anyone thought that the North Koreans were actually going to fire. And then we got underway in an attempt to go to the high seas, so to speak, and they did, in fact, begin to fire their weapons at us.
Outgunned, the Pueblo's commander, Lloyd Bucher, decided that trying to fight back would be suicidal.
Why we did not fight. Well, the simple answer is we didn't have the capability to fight. My entire weapons department consisted of one third-class gunner's mate.
Meanwhile, crew members frantically tried to destroy the ship's top-secret communications equipment.
Well, among the most valuable things the United States has are its encryption machines, its coding machines, because it's through those machines that the United States sends its most sensitive, most secret communications. When the Pueblo was captured, they were able to get some of that equipment.
The Koreans also got their hands on thousands of pages of top-secret Navy documents because the ship lacked the proper equipment to destroy them.
Any ship you would think that would carry around so many sensitive publications would have an emergency destruct system, but it didn't.
We were left to build small fires, try to throw things over the side, or use two shredders which we had, which tended to overload and trip circuit breakers, which you could feed one sheet at a time to.
The effort cost fireman Duane Hodges his life. A 3-inch North Korean shell hit him in the belly during the destruction operation.
The guy that died was one of those unsung type heroes that he had no business being there. He was an engineman. But he knew we needed help destroying this stuff, and so he was bringing it out and helping us destroy it.
Meanwhile, Commander Bucher desperately requested help from American ships and planes in the area.
We had no fleet assigned to us. We weren't part of any organization. And one of the problems that happened with the Pueblo was when we sent out our message saying we're under attack and we need help, nobody knew what the hell the Pueblo was.
By the time the Pueblo got the message out that it was being attacked, it was already attacked. And then they only had a brief amount of time between the time they were attacked and the time it was actually brought into Wonsan Harbor.
According to the crew, the North Koreans began beating them as soon as they reached shore. And a day after his capture, Commander Bucher signed a confession that the ship was spying in North Korean waters.
They gave me a hell of a beating and said they were going to commence killing my crew one at a time until such time as I signed that confession they had typed out.
Not only did Bucher sign the confession, he also was forced to read it in front of North Korean cameras.
We spied on various military installations and distribution of industries and the deployment of armed forces along the East Coast area, and sailed up to a point 7.6 miles off Rodo.
Officials in Washington denounced the confession as a fraud, and President Johnson vigorously protested the capture of the ship.
This week, the North Koreans committed yet another wanton and aggressive act by seizing an American ship and its crew in international waters.
The United States protested the seizure and took its complaint to the United Nations.
Ambassador Arthur Goldberg insisted once again and demonstrated on a map that the Pueblo was in international waters when she was boarded by the North Koreans.
All of this is verified not by reports solely from the Pueblo. All of this is verified by reports from the North Korean vessels.
There were calls from Congress for firmer action, for an attack on North Korea. But at the time, the president had a more vital priority, trying to find a way out of the Vietnam War.
Johnson was trying to achieve some kind of diplomatic settlement with the North Vietnamese. He did not know the extent to which the North Koreans had coordinated their action with the North Vietnamese. But a military strike against North Korea would have only made the situation worse at the negotiating table with the North Vietnamese.
So Johnson decided to negotiate with North Korea for the crew's release. And 11 months later, the North Koreans accepted an unusual arrangement. The U.S. would sign a document admitting that the Pueblo had entered North Korean waters for the purpose of spying. At the same time, the American chief negotiator would tell the world that the admission was a lie.
My signature will not and cannot alter the facts. I will sign the document to free the crew and only to free the crew.
The men of the Pueblo walked out of North Korea, but into an official investigation back home. Embarrassed by the first peacetime loss of a ship in more than a century, the Navy decided to convene a court of inquiry.
When the Pueblo came back, the only thing you had to compare it with was the USS Liberty. When the Liberty was attacked, you had a captain there who did everything he could to fight off the attacker. With the Pueblo, none of that happened. There wasn't a fight. He didn't get the ship back. He lost the ship.
One of the comments at the Court of Inquiry was, Captain, if you'd only spilled a little more blood.
The Court of Inquiry recommended court-martial proceedings against Commander Bucher and 2 other officers. But a little more than 4 months after the crew came home, Navy Secretary John Chafee decided to drop the charges.
It is my opinion that, even assuming that further proceedings were had, and even going so far as to assume that a judgment of guilt were reached, they have suffered enough, and further punishment would not be justified.
It would be another 2 decades before the Navy acknowledged the crew's ordeal at the hands of the North Koreans.
The Navy today finally honored the crew of the spy ship USS Pueblo, which was seized by North Korea more than 22 years ago. Retired Commander Lloyd Bucher and other crewmen received the Prisoner of War Medal and improved veterans' benefits.
Not long after he took office, President Reagan made it clear that he would not tolerate what he saw as the spread of Soviet communism to Nicaragua. To help oust the leftist Sandinista regime there, the president decided to supply right-wing rebels, known as the Contras, with military equipment, despite a congressional ban on such shipments. But the administration went ahead with the plan anyway, in secret. And at first the plan seemed to be working, until a plane was shot down and a crewman, an American, survived.
My name is Gene Hausenfuss. Marinette, Wisconsin.
A man identified as Eugene Hausenfuss, an American, who the Sandinistas report claims to be working for the United States. On the plane, the Nicaraguan government says, were 55 light machine guns, 50,000 rounds of ammunition, and assorted other military hardware.
When the plane went down on October 5th, 1986, Eugene Hausenfuss was the only member of its 4-man crew to survive. Charged with terrorism by the Sandinista regime, Hausenfuss claimed he had been hired to ferry arms to Contra rebels in Nicaragua.
He talked about being recruited to work for Southern Air Transport Company located in Miami, of being taken to El Salvador, where he and up to 26 other Americans worked on the missions.
And there were 2 Cuban nationalized Americans that worked for the CIA that did most of the coordination of these flights.
President Reagan quickly distanced himself from the failed mission.
There is no government connection with that at all. We've been aware that there are private groups and private citizens that have been trying to help the Contras to that extent, but we did not know the exact particulars of what they're doing.
Despite the denial, it wasn't long before suspicions were raised about White House involvement in the operation.
The captured American, Eugene Hausenfuss, says his boss was Max Gomez, an ex-CIA man. Several sources say Gomez was brought in by another ex-CIA man, Donald Gregg, now National Security Advisor to Vice President Bush.
Do you know Mr. Max Gomez?
That is something upon which I don't want to comment at this time.
I talked with Eugene Hausenfuss just days after his capture. Hausenfuss told me a pilot that he had known since his Vietnam days was killed on the abortive flight.
All I know is I was hired in July by a Mr. Cooper to work out of Central America. But I knew Mr. Cooper from back in the present during the Vietnamese War. Right. But he hired me underneath what he exactly said we'd be doing the work equivalent to what we did in Southeast Asia, but just a different time, different air, location, etiquette.
Is he the man who was on the plane who was killed?
Yes, sir.
Cooper was CIA when you worked with him for him back in Saigon.
He was Air America.
Which was the CIA airline back then.
Whichever it was, and it was CIA.
Yeah, I mean, you know it and I know it. Everybody knew that Air America was the CIA airline. He was CIA. You were CIA. What you're saying, in effect, is that you were doing the same thing with the same guy in Central America.
Correct.
Former Attorney General Griffin Bell acting as one of Hassenfuss's legal advisors, backed up Hassenfuss's story that he was just a small cog in a big machine.
Oh, he's an absolute pawn. Yeah, that's what the trial is about. It's a sort of a windfall for Nicaragua that they have him, and they can put on public display the whole foreign policy of our country toward Nicaragua.
While the Hassenfuss trial got underway in Nicaragua, another seemingly unrelated story came to light. Embarrassed U.S. officials confirmed in early November that they had been selling arms to what the U.S. officially called the terrorist regime in Iran, in exchange for a couple of U.S. hostages held in Lebanon. 3 weeks after that story appeared, yet another bombshell about where much of the money from the arms sales had gone.
Today, the Reagan administration said perhaps $30 million from the secret sales was laundered through Swiss banks, then sent to the rebels in Central America.
We don't know the exact amount yet. Our estimate is that it is somewhere between $10 and $30 million.
As Meese described it, here is how the deal worked. Beginning in January of this year, Iran paid Israeli arms dealers for shipments of American weapons. The Israelis deposited the money in Swiss bank accounts. The CIA withdrew $12 million and turned it over to the Pentagon as payment for the weapons. The rest went to the Contras.
The difference between the money owed to the United States government and the money received from representatives of Iran was then deposited in bank accounts which were under the control of representatives of the forces in Central America.
The money reportedly paid for weapons and for flights to deliver those weapons to the Contras. One of those flights apparently had been the ill-fated mission of Eugene Hassenfuss.
According to the logs for one of the pilots killed in the crash, there was approximately a four-fold increase in flights since February of this year, when the secret siphoning of funds began. The airlift operation also expanded in size by purchasing additional airplanes and hiring new crew members, including Eugene Hassenfuss, who was captured by the Sandinistas after his plane was shot down.
Congressional leaders announced plans to begin an investigation of what came to be called the Iran-Contra scandal. 3 weeks after the scandal broke, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega announced that he was pardoning Hassenfuss from a 30-year sentence so that he could go home to tell his story.
On stage with Ortega was Hassenfuss's wife, Sally.
I couldn't be more happy.
Tomorrow is their youngest son's birthday.
It couldn't be a better birthday present for Adam from President Ortega.
A month later, Hassenfuss was in the nation's capital.
Eugene Hassenfuss went to Washington today to tell about his part in the Iran-Contra connection. He was subpoenaed by the House Committee investigating the whole arms scandal. He was taken to a secret location to testify under oath.
By then, more evidence had surfaced linking the Hassenfuss mission to the U.S. government in the person of Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was a member of the National Security Council staff, was a key figure in Iran-Contra. The evidence came in the form of a check to Southern Air, the airline for which Hassenfuss worked, from something called Udall Research.
Udall Research has been linked to a network of secret bank accounts overseen by North and retired Air Force General Richard Secord, alleged to be North's conduit for shipping arms to Iran and the Contras. Secord's attorney denies that Secord had any relationship with Udall. However, in interviews last week with federal investigators, Eugene Hassenfuss claimed for the first time that some of the covert Contra supply operations he worked in were run by an associate of Secord's.
A few months later, joint congressional hearings into the entire Iran-Contra scandal got underway. Richard Secord was the first witness, and he admitted to taking part in the Iran arms sales, as well as helping to supply the Contras, including the Hassenfuss flight.
We believed very much in the significance of what we were doing and that our conduct was in furtherance of the President's policies.
Secord acknowledged that his operation had access to special encryption communication devices all over Central America, coordinating their activities with Lieutenant Colonel North at the White House. And Secord disclosed that former CIA Director William Casey was well informed.
He was well aware that we were cranking up this airlift operation, was in favor of it, knew of its importance.
The star witness of the hearings was Oliver North. Among other things, North contradicted President Reagan's disavowal of any U.S. connection to the Hasenfus flight.
When the Hasenfus plane went down in Nicaragua, the United States government told the American people that the United States government had no connection whatsoever with that airplane. Is that also true?
No, it was not true. I had an indirect connection with that flight.
Nearly 2 years after the hearings, the federal jury found North guilty of 3 Iran-Contra-related felonies. But a court of appeals later reversed those convictions. In 1990, the people of Nicaragua threw the Sandinistas out of power in a nationwide election. By then, Eugene Hasenfus had been back home in Wisconsin for 3 years. Unable to find steady work, he filed complaints against the government, seeking coverage for medical treatment he said that his ordeal in Nicaragua had made necessary.
I cannot claim it. I am a veteran, so I can go to a veterans hospital and get care, but I have to pay for it because it was not combat or war-related. Even though it was, it wasn't.
Even as he worried about how to pay his medical bills, he wondered what would have happened if he had not survived his flight.
I would think between Reagan, Bush, and North and them, it would have been a very delightful thing for them if I would have been killed. Yes, it would have stopped a lot of things.
Not only did the Iran-Contra scandal tarnish Ronald Reagan's second term in office, it left a black eye on the CIA and its late director, William Casey, the apparent mastermind of that illicit Central American supply operation. A little more than 10 years later, the CIA would find itself at the center of another controversy, this time over a bombing mission gone wrong. That story when the 20th century returns. Repeated NATO warnings to Serbia's president, Slobodan Milosevic, to halt attacks on ethnic Albanians in the province of Kosovo seemed to go nowhere. So, led by the United States, NATO undertook a bombing campaign to try to stop the Serb attacks, as well as weaken the Milosevic government.
F-117 stealth fighters took off again from Italy this evening as NATO launched strikes which NATO officials vowed would do serious damage to the Serb army. The primary military duty is to keep up the bombing until Serb President Milosevic cries uncle.
We intend to continue to wage this air campaign until we're satisfied that we have sufficiently degraded and damaged his military capability.
NATO showed off before and after pictures as evidence Serbia has been hit hard.
Here you'll see the arrows depicting the targets, and now quite clearly you'll see those targets very effectively taken out.
NATO officials reportedly believe that just a few days of that kind of bombing would make Milosevic fold and bring an end to the war. But that did not happen.
We're in the 9th day of this bombing campaign, and there's a rising frustration among NATO planners that the air war is not going as well as expected. And that's despite everything they've been able to throw at the Serbs, the precision bombs that these planes carry, the rockets, and the cruise missiles, which are incredibly accurate and are being fired at fixed targets.
According to NATO sources, military planners realized that the air campaign would likely last a lot longer than they'd expected. So they needed to identify additional targets. Patrick Eddington once worked as a military analyst for the CIA.
I think that whenever you're looking at an air-only operation, you're automatically putting more pressure on the planners, you're putting more pressure on the intelligence officers, you're putting more pressure on the pilots to maximize the violence to achieve the effect that you want to achieve. And that inevitably means that you're going to get into some problems.
That's one reason NATO planes at first refrained from bombing major cities, for instance, the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade.
They actually started on the periphery of the urban areas, going after oil storage facilities, for example. It's still far enough away from most of the downtown area where if they had a bomb that went stray, it was going to be very unlikely to cause any additional civilian casualties.
But with Milosevic apparently hanging tough, NATO decided to step up the pressure.
The NATO commander has now asked for 12 more F-117 stealth fighters to join the bombing campaign. That will double the number of stealth fighters flying out of bases in Italy and give NATO a greater ability to strike targets in downtown Belgrade. However,
there is disagreement among the Allies about striking downtown Belgrade. Italy, in fact, has put their opposition to striking targets in downtown Belgrade in writing, and since Italy is where the planes are based, that is a complete stopper on striking high-value targets in downtown Belgrade, and none were struck last night.
But the disagreements didn't last long. The very next day, NATO bombed Serbia's capital.
These are pictures from tonight. Belgrade is burning. Obviously, not the whole city, but a number of very important targets are in the process of being hit. Now, as the night began, it was the intention of NATO to strike targets such as the Defense Ministry, the Interior Ministry, communication centers, including the Air Defense Coordinating Headquarters for the Serbs. Also, communication centers such as the main telephone exchange.
Now that Belgrade was in play, planners began picking targets inside city limits. One target they singled out was Yugoslavia's Federal Directorate of Supply and Procurement, an agency that dealt with the flow of military hardware.
This was a circumstance, I think, where a particular analyst at CIA headquarters thought, you know, this is kind of the nerve center for Milosevic's logistics activity down in Kosovo. If we could zap this, we could really cause him a lot of chaos.
Because the CIA had chosen the target, NATO planners reportedly did little to check its accuracy. So, 6 weeks into the war, NATO planes set out to destroy the target as part of a massive raid on downtown Belgrade. But soon after the bombs fell, planners realized the building they hit was not the Yugoslav Directorate, but the Chinese embassy.
Of all the nightmare scenarios NATO could ever conceive, this is among the worst. The deliberate bombing of the wrong target, which happened to be the embassy of a country they were about to call on for support. It happened just before midnight. Witnesses say they saw 3 bombs hit in rapid succession. 30 people were inside the building. 3 of them didn't make it out.
This was a terrible accident.
Just how the embassy got in the crosshairs is unknown. NATO was looking for the Federal Directorate of Supply and Procurement, but a source now says they don't actually know where that building is.
Rejecting the explanation that the attack was a mistake, the Chinese charged the bombing was intentional.
The building is very obvious, and there is the flag flying. That's quite obvious. I don't believe that this is a mistake.
For the Chinese delegation, which had flown overnight from Beijing to Belgrade, witnessing the damage firsthand provoked outrage. NATO's act is a brutal violation of Chinese sovereignty and international law, said the delegation's leader. The Chinese government and people demand that NATO stop the bombing. This man's daughter, a Chinese journalist, was killed when the south side of the building was blown off. Why did they target the embassy, he says? Why did they kill my daughter?
Angry demonstrators besieged the U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
All day, the students and the workers have been coming to the U.S. Embassy here in downtown Beijing to lay the embassy under siege for the 3rd day in a row. These protests have not been particularly peaceful. More rocks have been thrown, more insults hurled. Some carry signs. One said, "Clinton lies, bombs fly, civilians die." The mood here very anti-American.
I don't think anyone really anticipated the depth of the anger of the Chinese people about this terrible, terrible tragedy.
President Clinton moved quickly to make amends to the Chinese.
I apologize, I regret this, but I think it is very important to draw a clear distinction between a tragic mistake and a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing.
What no one could figure out was how the mistake had occurred.
There's a system that's supposed to guard against those kinds of mistakes, and before a target can be hit, it has to be approved by a whole host of organizations. It has to be approved by the U.S. intelligence community, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by the U.S. European Command, and by NATO. All of those organizations passed on this target and approved it, even though, obviously, the location of the Chinese embassy is no secret.
The more investigators probed, the more the mistake seemed avoidable. And finally, it turned out the CIA analyst who picked the target had been issued an out-of-date map.
The map, produced by the National Imaging and Mapping Agency and last updated 2 years ago,
showed the Chinese embassy in a different part of Belgrade. The embassy had already moved from that old location to the building that was bombed, but the new address did not show up, either on the map or in any of the databases kept by the CIA, the Pentagon, and NATO.
If it were the right map, it would specifically have been labeled on the map, Federal Ministry of Supply. A few blocks away, it would have been properly labeled, Chinese Embassy, et cetera, et cetera. It would have been labeled in red. It would have been very, very obvious if the map had been up to date.
But the agency appeared to have let its mapping operation slide.
In the U.S. intelligence community, you're really not rewarded for keeping databases current. There's no professional glory in that. There are no promotions that come from doing that. There are no pay raises or special cash awards that come for keeping these computer databases up to date.
The news only got worse for the CIA.
The Washington Post says a CIA analyst repeatedly warned intelligence officials prior to the bombing that they might have targeted the wrong building. His concerns were never passed on to higher-level officials, according to the report.
This individual apparently brought up the fact that the map itself was not explicit and that there was some real question as to whether or not the Federal Ministry of Supply was actually located at that particular grid coordinate.
2 months after the bombing, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress the agency was at fault.
It is precisely when the pressure is intense, life or death decisions are being made that the President and the American people expect us to provide the best intelligence in the world. Clearly, in this case, we failed to do that.
Even though the Cold War has come to an end, the need for secrecy and spying has not. Most times, the public never hears about successful secret operations or spy missions. But when one of those missions goes awry, the consequences can be severe. Not only is the President of the United States embarrassed, even humiliated, as you've seen, it can also take years to repair the diplomatic damage. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.